is the Prevalent Risk Governance Podcast, featuring conversations with today's top C-suite executives and practitioners who not only look at third-party risk governance, but push through the boundaries to protect data. Now, here's Prevalent CEO Jonathan Dembrot and third-party evangelist Brenda Ferraro.
Jonathan and I are happy to have Peter Lesser, the Chief Information Officer at Skadden Arps, join us to discuss third-party risk related to legal vendors. Skadden is the largest law firm in the U.S., and Peter is responsible for the firm's technology strategy, planning, and implementation. He oversees application and user support, business systems, infrastructure and operations, and security and development. He is one of our founding strategic partners for the Prevalent Legal Vendor Network, and we're happy to have him here today to talk about nth parties, certifications, and incident response scenario-based tests.
Peter, I want to say thank you for joining us. This is going to be an excellent podcast. And in fact, for the audience that's joining us, just to give a sense for this, we're going to continue to talk about third-party risk. We're going to talk about security. We're going to talk about risk management in the legal community. And we're also going to do a scotch tasting. When we were preparing for this, we started talking about the difference between vendor versus third party. Those are drinking questions, in my opinion. What do you think, Brenda?
I agree, because supplier sometimes is used, and you never know.
Well, I have a logistical question. When these topics come up, is it customary to drink the scotch before you answer the question, or do you answer the question and then treat yourself to the scotch afterwards?
Oh, he's kind of saying, is it like drink as a reward or drink as a...
No, I think we have to drink prior to the answering of the hard questions, in my opinion.
For the courage. So it's a courage sip.
I think that's probably the right answer, in my opinion. So, and I tell the story a little bit, Peter. So one of the first times that we actually got to meet was as we were talking about how we could help solve third-party risk for the legal community. And so you are extremely involved in helping manage the community security generally and bringing people together and driving a community approach to these things. So Peter invited us to the first meeting with how many? I think it was 21 of your peers at the time, right? About 21. And so I still tell people this is the hardest meeting of my entire career. And what was interesting about it was they were asking all the right questions. So,
hard questions?
But they were all hardball questions. And so I remember, Peter, you asked me a really interesting question. And you said, Jonathan, we're going to solve this as a community, but what happens if we don't get enough of the community to do this together? And I think my response was something like, well, Peter, you're going to pay more money. And I think I didn't know if you were going to yell at me, but the response, you started like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. You started laughing. And I thought, okay, this is going to go well.
But it was a great, honest response. And I think we're very fortunate that the legal community is very tight-knit. And there's this sense that we are not in competition with each other. And in fact, law firms never use that term competitor. They use the term peer. Right. And there's this whole colloquial nature of how we treat each other and how we relate to each other. And we do view it as a community either succeeding together or not succeeding together. And it's in everyone's best interest to work as a team. Yeah.
And we've been super fortunate to be part of that with you and with the other members of that community. And so, what we wanted to do is talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on. We were hoping to kind of get your view on third-party risk, and we want to keep this free form. Again, when I see a hard one, we're going to go straight to the scotch. So, Brenda, why don't you go ahead and kick us off here? You have you want to kind of open this up with some comments around third party and some of the things that you were seeing? And
sure. The one thing that's boggling my mind is that a lot of companies are talking about the fact that they're not looking at fourth party assessments. And we really need to follow the data from the first party to the third party to the nth party. What are your thoughts on making sure that we're doing that now versus waiting until later?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, but it's one that's very, very challenging for us to respond to.
This is a drink. This is a drinking.
It was difficult?
No. This is that would Brenda.
We didn't even make it past the first question.
Listen. First of all, you started with a hard question, so I'm stopping us here. This is like, have you ever played that game Exploding Kittens? So my daughters bought this game, and there's a stop card.
Oh.
I don't know if you've seen it. So
no.
We're gonna So fourth parties is a hard question. So this is a I can tell you this
one.
This is a I believe it's a 12-year-old. So this one. Relatively smooth.
Not a lot of peat.
Not a lot of peat. That's right. I
It's just good.
I think one later on will have be a little more peaty. Okay, so we got that one down. So Peter, fourth party. So this, and I know cloud is a big issue here too.
There is the challenge that you don't always know, and it's not always easy for you to determine that there is another party behind the party with whom you think you're working with directly. In a number of cases, we've had conversations with vendors with whom we work, and we've said almost casually, well, you're doing this yourself, right? And they usually start with, well, of course we're doing this ourselves, but we also use, and then you start to get a long list of third parties to them that are part of their process. And so it is challenging because you don't know. And I think in order for us to really follow the data, we have to more aggressively speak with those vendors with whom we work to understand where they have vendors behind them. And sometimes it's not a vendor behind them, it's layer upon layer. And it is a lot of work. I think people have tried to make it easier by saying to the vendor with whom they have the relationship directly, here are the rules. You're responsible for everything after you. And you have to take our rules and go down the line with them.
Well, on that, does that mean that the liability sits with the first or the third party when you expect the third party to do that due diligence of the nth party?
That's something you have to negotiate. And when you look at that specific issue, I think our firm and our peer firms are very concerned about that issue of liability. And none of us want to be in a position that we're assuming liability for some other organization. And some of us will aggressively push back and say, we'll take liability for our own actions. We'll be clear about third parties that we work with, but we can't assume liability for them beyond us.
Right.
Yeah, it introduces kind of contract challenges as well as compliance challenges and agency issues, right? So one of the biggest things that we see in not only the legal community but also other areas is this concept of, we all know from a security perspective somebody's going to have a problem at some point, right? We also know that those things will persist, across all effectively the spectrum of controls that now, or frankly, the surface area of the controls that now exist between the first party, the third party, the fourth party, the fifth party, whatever that looks like. So this is getting harder. So
it is getting harder, and I think the thing that's making it even more and more challenging is, as you've said, is those cloud providers, and a lot of the cloud providers are providing a layer in a product. And so if you're providing software as a service, that doesn't mean you're providing the infrastructure behind the software as a service. And you may find that there are a few layers behind that. Unfortunately, it has led quite a few of us, and I think maybe law firms are more aggressive about this than others, to internalize as much as is possible. I know for a lot of organizations, the term cloud first is a mantra they're following quite aggressively. For a long time, I joked our motto was cloud never, but we've evolved significantly. Now we're not at cloud never, we're at cloud last.
Right.
But it's still a long way from the cloud first type approach. And that has really been brought to us because of the pressures that our clients put upon us and our concern of the liability of the next vendor down the line. And the more of it we can do within our walls, with our people, with our owned infrastructure, the less concern we have about that next party in the chain.
Yeah, I was in a conference and the keynote speaker was talking about bunnies in the middle of a security conference. And he goes, here's a picture, and yes, it's two bunnies. But what happens in a dark room with two bunnies? It just keeps multiplying and multiplying. And he goes, that's the cloud environment. It's just expanding exponentially.
Yeah, and I think it's that exponential growth, but also, when we start looking at the breaches, right, the things that are impacting organizations aren't always the vendors you would expect, right? Sometimes they're small vendors that are having a huge impact, right? So I know we've talked about in a couple of situations in healthcare as an example where, some of the largest healthcare providers had issues with with Petya, right, and non-Petya, where, small vendor impacts 600-700 servers in 5 minutes. Within 10 minutes, it's 10,000 servers. And costs
Across the globe.
$600 million for a vendor that's this tiny little vendor. I think that's really what we have to deal with moving forward. It's no longer worrying so much about the biggest vendors. It's worrying about anybody in the chain that just frankly introduces risk, right? It's no longer about size.
And all of them introduce risk, as you said earlier.
Right.
It is just a matter of when. It's not a matter of if. It is going to happen, and we're going to all try to have something along the path that minimizes the impact, but we have to be prepared for it to happen at some point.
Yeah. And now, obviously, you spend a lot of time with ILTA. Maybe talk a little bit about the community effort. Obviously, I've spent a lot of time with you and some of your peers around thinking about how can we improve security in the industry as a group. Obviously, this includes the smallest vendors in the or smallest law firms in the community, all the way to the largest, like yourself, the largest community members. But there's a responsibility across the spectrum, right? So, what are your thoughts on how that works? And
well, I think we're very fortunate. We have a long history with ILTA and its predecessors. And when LegalSec was founded a number of years ago, we wanted to bring even more attention to the issues of security inside of law firms. And very quickly, everyone got together and said, yes, this is important to all of us, and let's see what more we can do than we did in the past. And a structure is now in place where we have an annual conference. We will have hundreds of people show up a few weeks from now. We'll have a variety of sessions focused on different groups. This year, we're taking a new and somewhat different approach. Instead of just having a number of sessions that run concurrently in which each person can pick which session they would like to attend, we've developed a series of tracks. We're trying to make this as meaningful as possible to as many of the attendees. We've picked 3 primary tracks. We have a track for the large law firms, generally for senior management in IT or people who have information governance responsibility. And we have a focus track that they'll find meaningful to them. We have a second track for technical security professionals. And so the most technical people attending are not going to come to high-level, big-picture type sessions, but sessions led by them for them that will be very technical and will be meaningful in terms of them having content they can bring back and be proactive about. The third track is the one I'm really most proud of. It is a track for those of the least resources, be they financial or staffing. And I think it's critical that we remember that law firms span an enormous range, from some very small firms to some very large. And as a community, either we'll all do well or we won't. And to that end, we have to help those who may be in a more challenging position financially from a technology standpoint and staffing. And so having a track dedicated to them, having them come back with really actionable items that they can go work on immediately without step one being ask for a new budget, things they can do themselves. And I think that's going to have a great impact on a significant numbers of members of the LegalSec community. Our fourth track is a general track. It's things that didn't meet or easily fit in the first 3. But I think we're going to have a great summit this year. But LegalSec's not the only group. We're now about 2 years into the LSISAO, and that's also been very active. The government has been very specific about the desire to have ISACs and ISAOs for organizations vertically aligned so that we can share with our peers best practices and current events. And when I look at what LegalSec's doing, when I look at what the LSISAO is doing, I think it reflects well upon our community, because it's not that we're doing the bare minimum. I think in many cases we're doing what verticals much larger than us are doing, and we're doing it in an even more cooperative manner than they are.
Yeah, I agree 100%. We often talk about maturity within these industries, right? And I think the tough part with the legal industry, which also kind of persists in some other industries as well, is just you've got such a disparity between, small and large firm, right? So in terms of both maturity and being able to afford, frankly, some of those security controls. So I think what you guys are doing is unbelievable. It's fantastic. I've been involved in sponsoring a lot of that, and just the conversations are unbelievable, the sharing of knowledge and everything that goes on there. So.
Well, we're even seeing pervasively that the legal network is doing much better than the other sectors because of that partnership that you have with each other and the non-competitiveness.
Well, and Peter was a visionary. So Peter and his peers decided to do this 2 years before some of the other communities. So even though they say they're maybe more mature, you guys have been on this. You've been really looking at this, and it's been a big focus area.
Yeah, and I'm thrilled to be part of this, but it clearly wasn't me. It was a group of my peers of which I'm a member, and it was a group coming together and saying, we have a shared issue, and no one of us is actually going to solve it well if we go off and try to do something. But if we get together and we put together a structure that really is useful for all of us, we will all do well. And I think the Legal Vendor Network is a great example of what we can do when we work as a community to create something that there's a great need for, but that none of us are big enough to have the wherewithal to do on our own.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm gonna make this a drinking question. So let's talk a little bit about certification. So this is number 2. So before I ask my question, this is number 2. Let's see. A little bit different. I don't think this is as old.
I like it better.
It's a little, yeah.
It's a little lighter.
Lighter, definitely lighter.
Certification discussion is not lighter.
Okay, so from a certification perspective, obviously there's a number of different approaches today, right? So, ISO is a primary approach that in the legal community I've spoken to a lot of people about. Some firms are looking at SOC 2, some people are talking about other certifications. What is the thought process here? What do you think about it? Where's this going?
Yeah, I unfortunately have a less than positive view on some of this. While we are certified, and we've done as our peers have, we are ISO certified within our IT department. We have ISO and SOC reports for our data centers. We do this because there is an industry expectation of it. The question is, how much of that certification led to meaningful improvements within these organizations? And I think there is a range here. For some organizations, the big value and I'll pick ISO specifically. LegalSec picked ISO early on as a benchmark for the organization, said we should follow standards like ISO certification. I think for many of the first firms that did it, it looked good from a client development standpoint. It looked good from an industry standpoint. Internally, for some, the biggest value was really organizationally. It gave them a structure to start putting together security and all of the pieces that layer on top of it from a process standpoint, a people standpoint, a policy standpoint, and last but not least, the tools. And so I do think for those who didn't have the structure previously, it had incredible value. And I know a number of my peers have said this helped them to evolve more quickly than they would have evolved organically. And so to that end, it's got enormous value. We were a little later to our ISO certification than some of our peers. Because we were a little later and because we happen to have critical mass, I think we had a lot of the organization before. And so for us, it was more of taking what we do and organizing it the way that ISO wants to see it. At the end, there's no downside to something like ISO certification. And so I'm not trying to say anything negative, but I think it has a range of values depending where in the maturity spectrum you are when you start the process. The other ones are a little different. As law firms, a law firm itself is not likely to get a SOC 2. While we may get a SOC 2 for a data center that we use, that's very different than our core business. A SOC 2 for the practice of law, or even ISO certification for the practice of law, it's a little weird.
Right.
It just doesn't match.
Right.
And so I think some of these certifications are valuable. I think the community has embraced them and has pursued them. But I think each organization has to see where they are in their evolution and which of them make sense at which point and which don't.
Yeah. And what's interesting is, we've been talking about this. I think your view on that is absolutely dead on. We've been talking about this in the context of also using it as a mechanism to avoid a risk assessment as a good example, right?
Or to get cybersecurity insurance.
And it's really hard, right? Because I don't think, I look at some of the things that, would you allow it to be a proxy for your vendors? And the reality is, no, you need to do a risk assessment, right? Risk assessment and managing a process and being able to go through that and then monitoring that becomes really important, right?
Well, and again, with ISO specifically, because you can define your own scope, to ensure that it really is meaningful to the outsider looking at it, it may or it may not. And so I do think there was a point where some of us thought it would change the assessment process that our clients put us through. But in the end, I don't think it really has at all. It is a check mark along the way.
Yeah, it adds, but it's not.
I do agree with him, though, that it made it so
adds.
that there was accountability within the organization, that if you didn't have something in place, it gave you a guideline to put it together. But it's almost like if you have a certification and that certification is completed, how do you make sure that it's continually effective and enforced?
Well, and I think part of that is the maturity of the organization that has achieved the certification. ISO makes it a little easier. Continual improvement is part of ISO. And so there is an expectation that at each point, and when I look at our regular meetings, we are constantly talking about, okay, what is it that we think we're doing better than we did before? What is it that we should pursue to do better than we're doing today? And ISO as a certification really does not only promote that, they require that. And I think that's one of the most positive things about the ISO certification is that you do get in a mindset of continual improvement. And that continual improvement is possibly the most important thing that all of us can do. Security is not something that you can say, okay, I finished, I'm done with security. It's much more like, putting that plant in your garden, and you're going to water it, and you're going to fertilize it, and you're going to look at what's happening in the environment. Was it sunny? Was it rainy? Was it cloudy? You have to keep all that in mind just to keep that plant or that flower looking as good as it did, not even to make it better. And so the concept of continual improvement is critical in the long-term success of any of our firms from a security standpoint.
Yeah, and speaking of continual improvement or evolutionary approach, how about business resiliency? Do you see the law firms doing scenario-based tests or frequently testing for business resiliency?
And there are different elements of business resiliency. If we're talking about the technology infrastructure, I'll say absolutely. I think the large firms have aggressively pursued some method of achieving complete redundancy so that in the event of a catastrophic failure, whether it be one of the offices in which our attorneys practice, whether it be one of our data centers, there is some way that all technology infrastructure from those locations is fully redundant somewhere else. And so I think our community has done a great job at that. I think it has gotten easier for us to do this over time. Virtualization has played an enormous part in that. Our ability to develop an infrastructure that we can easily move processes, move applications from physical system to physical system, and even which we can fail over to another location. Virtualization has helped us tremendously. But I think this is a place where we get the benefit of not being as large as many of our clients so that it's easier for us to achieve certain goals. And from a redundancy, resiliency, disaster recovery standpoint, I think the law firm, especially the large firms, have done a fantastic job. I think at the mid-tier and down, this is where the cloud is becoming a really critical part of that. But the challenge for those firms is understanding what the cloud is really offering them. Is it backup as a service? Is it infrastructure as a service? And they'll figure a way to replicate. So there are certain challenges they'll meet along the way, but there are a lot more options, and many of those options are cost effective for the mid-size and smaller firms, differently than the big firms who will build something out in its entirety to replicate their primary facilities.
My experience with crisis management and incident management, my favorite part about going through those scenario-based tests was the opportunity to see that the law firms that were external to your company that you worked with became your best friends. They were able to tell you what you should communicate, what you shouldn't communicate, when you should communicate it, and keep your company brand protected. And so that's something that I'm seeing that's also growing rapidly with regards to if a ransomware or a malware attack occurs and you do have your resiliency and business resiliency in place, there's still that communication that has to happen with your clients and with your internal and external constituents.
Yeah, at our firm, we actually have two, and I don't want to call them entirely separate paths, but somewhat separate. We do have a technology-based disaster recovery plan, and it talks about how we will recover services required by the firm, and there are very specific timeframes of how quickly they'll come back and what is our tolerance for data loss. But entirely separate from that, we have an entire crisis management team. That crisis management team spans every office throughout the globe. We regularly do exercises in local offices, and I'm fortunate to be part of that team. We will go office by office. We'll sit down with the crisis management team in a given office, and we'll play out scenarios with that team. And we'll take the local team in each office through what would you do if this were to happen. And that's an entirely different piece than if something happens in your data center. The third piece to us is we have a severe incident response plan and team that if something really bubbles all the way up to the most senior management, and we do have a level of severity that certain incidents will take on, that we have to bring it into an entirely different place. And within our severe incident response plan, we have very specific language around what are we going to say to the firm's partners? What are we going to say to our clients? What might we have to say to the public at large? Do we need to go to the press? We also have things like if it involves PII, do we have to go to the Department of Health and Human Services? As of, and I can look at my watch now because GDPR is there.
Oh, this is number 3.
That's number 3.
Yeah, that's number 3. Okay, so you mentioned
like a dirty word.
No, we already said the word is gonna for the third one will be GDPR. So we are very, very close. And let's see. Ooh, that's a little sharper than the other 2, right?
Yeah, there's a lot more going on here.
Yeah, this is
a little bit of peat.
Little peaty.
A little more smoky.
Smoky. Sharper. That one's different. That was different. Just like
GDPR.
Just
right?
like GDPR. That one's a punch.
Before we go to that topic, because I know that can take us in a very, very interesting direction. The one last question that I have to ask about with your incident response is, do you involve your third parties in a scenario-based test to understand if data is impacted by them? Are they telling you that they're impacted? Are they remediating and you're tracking that? Or what does it look like for your firm in that area?
So we've involved third parties in that process in that they're part of our tabletops. And so we do tabletop exercises 2 different directions. Our severe incident response team, we bring in a moderator to do a series of event-based tabletop exercises annually. It's part of the team's mandate. We've used third parties to help us with that. And we've had third parties come in, run that event. They bring the scenarios. They bring experts. They're not our vendors per se, but we're bringing in an expert to help us understand what are the kinds of scenarios we should be talking about and that we should be prepared for. Now, the plan itself does have some very specific items in terms of if we need a forensics expert, who do we go to? If we have to go to law enforcement, who do we? And we have names, phone numbers, email addresses. We have all of that there in advance so that if we need to get to those types of organizations at an office-by-office level, on the crisis management side, this is reams of information. So I can actually go to our crisis management portal and say, show me who's responsible for the air conditioning systems in our White Plains office. Show me who is the electrician for the New York office. And we have all of those providers that we would have to work with in the event of some sort of crisis or disaster. Clients are not part of the process, but it's very well defined in terms of when would we go to our clients? How quickly would we go? How would we go? We have an entire database of the breach notification requirements that our clients bring to us as part of their outside counsel guidelines, and we track them on a client-by-client basis so that we know if we have to reach out to them, who at the client are we going to reach out to? How do they want us to reach out to them? And what are their requirements in terms of timing?
Do you find that that's all over the place? Is some of them 4 hours, some of them 2 days, some of them, or are they following some systematic standard?
So I will say we try to help set that standard. We want there to be one standard.
Right.
For us, it's really challenging having thousands of clients who want us to do things in thousands of different ways. And so we have our default. When our clients come to us with outside counsel guidelines, we will typically react and say, here is our standard. if you will accept our standard, we don't have to do anything unique, and it's actually better for you because this is built into our process, it's built into our procedures, and the vast majority find that acceptable. In some cases, they do have unique requirements, and we will try to satisfy those as best we can. But I mean, now with that the regulation whose name will go unsaid.
We don't have a fourth one here, unfortunately.
There's specific reporting requirements. The magic number is 72 hours. And so we are required, and our firm, like many, have not only offices in Europe, but a significant number of clients in Europe. And so we will follow those regulations as we must.
Mm-hmm. We actually did a podcast on GDPR. It's been our actually most popular podcast so far. Yes. I feel like this one's going to be a good one. But we talked about beer pong on that one. We didn't play beer pong, but
I'm seeing a theme.
I think this is, somebody's going to start questioning whether we're alcoholics or not. So I think we're, kind of as we wrap this up, before I actually expose the scotches and the names of the scotches, kind of as we're wrapping up, one of the questions here is really around phishing, but I want to broaden that a little bit. So, phishing seems to still be working. Malware is still creating havoc. We're still seeing some of the challenges that have plagued us for years. What's the biggest vector of concern for the community, in your opinion? What is the thing that we got to go think about from a security and a risk management perspective and really go tackle? And if we don't tackle, it's just going to
wreak havoc.
Continue to be such a pain for us as a community.
It's our personnel. It goes without saying. It is our number one concern. And to that end, we do try to have awareness programs that help our people understand what the paths of entry are and what habits they can adopt that will protect themselves, protect the clients with whom we work, and protect the firm in its entirety. And when people ask me about our internal security organization, they'll say, well, how big is your security team? And my answer is it's just about 3,800 people.
That's right.
And if it is not every partner, every attorney, and every staff person at my firm, we're never going to succeed.
Yeah.
And so we need to have outreach and education so that each one of those individuals is aware that they're part of the process and that we need their help. We, like others, are going to do fake phishing exercises to try to keep people on their toes. But we're also going to have security awareness training. We're going to have ethics training. We have GDPR training.
Yep.
All of that training is critical so that people are aware of what should be concerned. And so they're in a position to help us be part of the solution and avoid being part of the problem.
Yeah, you're in a people business and you have to have a culture of security to solve it, right? So, okay, so with that, we are now going, it's a little bit of a drum roll. So the first scotch, I will tell you, was Glenlivet 12. Okay? So we thought a little lighter, kind of smooth. I would expect that from the Glenlivet because, very popular scotch, right? Now, I chose a single malt American. So this is not a scotch per se. Ooh. But it had kind of a similar flavor, kind of similar flavor,
this
smooth.
Was number 2?
This was number 2. It's called Cedar Ridge Single Malt Whiskey.
But I'm going to say we sort of thought this was a little sweeter.
We thought it was light.
Lighter, sweeter.
And I would associate the little bit of sweetness with American whiskeys.
Yeah. So single malt, same kind of deal, little sweeter. That's right. There's also another single malt I like out of Texas called Balcones, but I could not get that here today. The third one, you were right. A little bit of a peaty. This is prototypical Scotch whiskey Oban 14. And so absolutely much more of that sharper, peaty kind of, very, significant dimensional whiskey.
And that is, and I don't drink a lot of Scotch at home, but when I do, Oban is one of my go-tos. It's a Macallan 12, Oban 14. Those tend to be my go-to. They've got enough going on, but they're not
right in your face,
punching
you in the face. Yeah. So Peter, I want to say thank you. Thank you for coming by. Thank you for indulging us in this whiskey and Scotch tasting. I think it goes a long way in helping to reduce risk, actually. This is a risk reduction. The Scotch is a part of our risk reduction focus and our strategy today. So I want to say thank you. I know that our listeners are really excited about hearing what community and what your thoughts are around how to help drive security. And I think this is going to be great.
So LegalSec is coming up on June 11th, and ILTACON is scheduled August 19th. Peter, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks.
That's great.
Thank you for listening to the Prevalent Risk Governance Podcast. Connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and visit us at prevalent.net. You can also rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts.